Alrighty, welcome in everyone to another edition of Just Another College Football Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Monday, July 14th, and we got a lot of media days to talk about. We have a ton of things from the Big 12 media days that went on this past week, and then we got to talk about the SEC media days that got underway today, about 10 minutes from me, actually, at the College Football Hall of Fame in downtown Atlanta. A ton of different things coming out of that, even in the first day. We'll talk about some little things. We'll get into a more in-depth breakdown of the SEC media days on Friday, but we'll break down a couple of those things towards the later end of the show. On the second part of the show, I definitely want to get into the biggest concerns I have for at least my top 10, and I'll probably break out a new top 10 here, maybe the start of August, somewhere around there, to kind of update that as we head into the season. But as of right now, I'll use my post-spring top 10, and we'll get into my biggest concerns for those teams that at the end of the day want to be vying for a national championship, and then we'll do kind of the wrap-up. We'll talk about SEC media days, maybe add in a couple of little things, a little bit of Nick Saban talk that we'll get into more depth on Friday, but definitely some things coming out of Greg McElroy's mouth that has a lot of people at least interested to see what happens over the next little bit. We'll talk about some recruiting updates. UGA continues to be the most dominating force on the trail right now, and we'll talk about a couple other things at the end of the show there. But let's go ahead and jump into this thing, because Big 12 Media Days was last week in Dallas, Texas, obviously in Jerry World, where they will have their conference championship here pretty shortly, or at the end of the year. But it was a very, very busy week. There's no doubt about that. Not necessarily these massive, massive storylines coming out of it. No one said anything crazy. No one said anything out of pocket, as they say, but there were definitely some storylines that I want to get into, and I think the biggest one, in my opinion at the very least, was Brett Yormark. Brett Yormark's confidence in this conference is very, very clear. It is very obvious that this guy feels very, very bullish about the future of this conference going forward, and he doubled down on that. When he was talking at the media days this past week, he said, "I am fully in favor of a 5+11 format because in reality, it's probably not going to help us for 2, 3, maybe even 4 years. I believe we're going to be a good enough conference where maybe 5 years and beyond, we can kind of compete for way more of those at-large spots that as of right now don't seem like they're going to go to us. They very well could down the road." And that's something that he kind of reiterated. I don't know if this is something that I fully believe, if I'm being totally honest. I think the gap in terms of money, in terms of media deals, in terms of prestige in the SEC and the Big Ten is going to be really hard to run down. Just in general, the Big 12 has a lot of ground to make up. That being said, I think Brett Yormark's doing an incredible job. I think he's opening so many different doors for the Big 12. He's bringing in money that I think a lot of us didn't even see being brought into college football, and we'll get into that here in a second, but a lot of different great things that this guy has done, and he thinks that his conference is going to follow. He thinks they are going to be able to be at the very top of the world and possibly be in the conversations with the SEC and the Big Ten going forward. And that's something that I fully respect the confidence. I don't necessarily fully agree with him. I do think the Big 12 probably should take the auto bid format, but at the end of the day, I fully understand where he's coming from and really respect the confidence that he has in his conference. So it'll be really interesting to see that unfold. He did say that they would get multiple teams into the field this year. Very much possible. There's no doubt about that. But I think unlike last year, you're going to have to see a couple of teams separate, whether that's Arizona State and Texas Tech, or that's Iowa State, Kansas State, or any Utah and Oklahoma State. Who knows? Who knows who separates from that conference? But we saw last year, if the Big 12 gets into a big knot up at the top, especially up at the top, it's going to be really hard for that second team to get in. Even going into that game, I think everyone understood that whoever lost that game was not going to be in the dance. And I think that could be a reality going into this year if they have kind of the crazy year that they had last year. And frankly, I expect that, and maybe even a little bit more from the Big 12 this year. So Brett Yormark has the utmost confidence in his conference. He probably should. He's done a really, really incredible job with them since taking over. Obviously, kind of expedited Texas and Oklahoma leaving because it probably gave them a better chance to land on their feet afterwards, and they definitely done that. So we'll see what happens with this playoff talk. Obviously something to keep your eye out on, but Brett Yormark is very, very confidently standing on the 5+11 format. He'll get some pushback from the Big Ten, but seems like enough people are on his side to get that moving forward, and then we'll see what happens a couple of years from now. Maybe the Big 12 is on the same level of the SEC and the Big Ten and are competing right there for national titles as well. But the biggest story that came out of this, in my opinion at the very least, was Scott Frost. He took a little bit of a shot at Nebraska, actually not that little of a shot, a shotgun to the chest, frankly, to Nebraska and its fan base. He was being asked about taking that job, about what advice he would give to himself or to other coaches that are kind of looking to make their way up in the industry. And he said very plainly, don't take the wrong job. And obviously that made a lot of Cornhusker fans not too happy. Let's just be totally honest. That was a little bit of a shot at them. He actually went on to say, I said I wouldn't leave UCF unless it was a place I could win a national championship. So, he said, I got tugged in a direction to try to help my alma mater, and I didn't really want to do it. It wasn't a good move. I'm lucky to be back at a place where I can be happier. He also got into a little bit of details about how when he's walking around Orlando, he can kind of go unnoticed. Not everyone's turning around saying, hey, there's the head football coach of UCF. In Lincoln, they're doing that. There's no doubt about that. And they definitely have a lot of eyes on you, a lot of expectations on you, and that can be really tough. There's no doubt about that. And I want to be very clear. What head coaches and their families and all of that stuff, what they go through around college campuses can be terrible. There's a lot of people looking at you. You're always on display. When you lose a game on Saturday, you might be a little bit more hesitant to go out and get brunch on Sunday. That's just kind of the way college football works. Here's my thing. If you're a head coach that really wants to win national championships, that really wants to be a competitive person in this sport and wants to compete at the highest level, this is a uniquely terrible take. It is a take that will keep you from winning national titles because I'm sorry, UCF is great, and maybe by some miracle you can find a way to make that a national championship program. I don't think you can, but whatever program you move on to, whatever program is prepared to win a national title, you get that. Regardless of where you are. Even in Austin, Texas, I bet Steve Sarkisian would tell you he gets a lot of looks. He gets a lot of people stopping him. Now, lately, it's been a lot of people stopping him to thank him for bringing Texas back to where they're supposed to be, but that can change in a hurry, and he's fully aware of that. In Athens, Georgia, you best believe Kirby Smart can't go anywhere without being just hounded by people, good or bad. So this is part of college football. If you want to be an elite head coach in the sport, the outside stuff is going to be a part of it. And if you can't handle it, you're not going to be a national championship head coach. So Scott Frost, I have a ton of respect for him. I think he's going to do a good job at UCF. Now, it's gotten a whole lot harder to win around Orlando than it was the first time he was there. When they were in the AAC, they had a leg up in finances and talent of everyone else in that conference. That's not the case in the Big 12. And frankly, even if he does well at UCF, where are you going to where you can both win a national championship and walk through the streets without getting noticed? Because as far as I know, those places don't exist in college football. So I thought that was a crazy quote. I thought it was a quote that beyond what, attacking other people and pushing the blame on other people for what happened at Nebraska, which he had plenty of a hand in. Not everything was his fault, obviously, but he had plenty of a hand in the failures at Nebraska. At Nebraska, he had plenty of a hand in the failures there. The reality is, when you get back to the elite level, the place where you can win a national championship, you're going to have that. So if you don't want to deal with that, then maybe you should just set up shop in Orlando, and if that doesn't work out there, then go be in media. Go do something else, because the reality is, if you want to win a national championship and not get noticed when you go out on the street, those two things don't go together in college football. Whether you like that or not, that's up to you, but the reality is, this did not make me very happy about Scott Frost. I'll be totally honest. I don't necessarily love the comments. I frankly think it means he's not all that serious about winning a national title. But we'll see what happens with Scott Frost. Obviously very excited to see what happens down in Orlando, but this was not a great start at the very least. Deion Sanders was at the media days, and first of all, great to see him there. Obviously had some health issues early on in the offseason, was away from the team for some time during spring. He's found his way back and seems fully locked in. Both quarterbacks were there with him, Juju Lewis as well as Caden Salter, so he kind of left the people guessing, and I think he doesn't know who's going to start for him, so he brought both those guys. It was very interesting to hear from both those guys about how all that's going. I still think it's going to be Caden Salter, but we'll see what happens down the road. The big thing from this was he called for a salary cap in college football, talked about how the crazy money being thrown around. We talked about Texas Tech and Felix Ojo last week. Sounds like those numbers were a lot less than people were reporting initially, but the reality is a lot of money is being thrown around. We know that a lot of teams are going over that salary cap, quote unquote, that was put in place by the House settlement. because they can. At least they could up until July 1st. I think this thing is going to get a little bit weird. I think the reality is a lot of us thought when the House settlement was passed, that was essentially a salary cap. Whether it was 15 million or 16 million or whatever you decided in your athletic department, you had a certain amount of money to spend. And obviously this year, as you're kind of doing the in-between, it makes things a little bit more complicated. You didn't have the rules until July 1st. You paid a lot of guys before July 1st. I can promise you that. So there's going to be really expensive rosters this year, and I think this is something that very much has to happen. There's no doubt about that. I just thought it just happened. Frankly, I thought the House settlement was the thing that put in a salary cap for college football. Doesn't seem like Dion thinks that, and frankly, I think a lot of coaches feel the same way Dion does, so we'll see what happens there. That's something we can talk about at the end of the show. We'll talk about the SCORE Act, something that has been brought up lately that hopefully would bring this to a more crystallized space, a more crystalline structure, but at the end of the day, this is something we very much need. I think everyone agrees that the amount of money being thrown around is absolutely crazy. Even if you have a salary cap and then you have your quote-unquote bag men that have been there in the past, I think it's much better than where we are right now. So I do think everyone agrees with this. Frankly, I thought the House settlement was supposed to do that, and maybe it will in time, but as of right now, it seems like a lot of coaches are kind of singing the same tune that Dion is singing, and not necessarily the greatest one for college football, at least as of right this second. Cody Campbell is someone I want to talk about. I talk about Cody Campbell before I talk about Joey McGuire, which sounds a little bit odd, but Cody Campbell made some waves at Big 12 Media Days. That's not him there, but at the end of the day, he was all around Dallas. He was talking to just about everyone that was willing to listen, and it's going to be really interesting to watch this guy go to work over the next little bit. He is not shy at all about the money that he's spending to get Texas Tech back into the game. He fully understands that that's part of the game. You know, Texas Tech is not on the level of a Texas or a Texas A&M or an Oregon or a Georgia or a Bama when it comes to funds year over year. They could be with this guy in the picture, that's for sure. They also got a big-time kind of a little bit of smoke, at the very least, around one of the top players in the 2027 class, LaDainian Guyton, incredibly talented defensive lineman. A couple people started taking shots at Cody Campbell for for showing a little bit of love to LaDainian Guyton, and he said, I'm not going anywhere. A lot of people were making the joke that you got to do this about 3 or 4 more times before Texas Tech is really going to be in that national championship conversation, and I tend to agree with that overall, but I do think it's going to be really interesting to watch. This guy is boisterous at the very least. He is very, very outspoken, and I think it's going to be really, really cool to watch, and there's no doubt about it. And I've said time and again that Texas Tech needs to do this. You know, if you're going to play big boy football, if you're going to compete for national titles the way that they want to, you need a lot more money pumping into that place, and they're trying to pull that off. The reality is, all I'm going to say is maybe don't be this in the public eye. Maybe don't be the guy that the NCAA or the College Sports Commission or NIL Go or Brett Seeley, all of the different people that have just been introduced to this landscape from the House settlement, just kind of don't put yourself on their minds, because I think they're looking for a win at some point. I don't know if they would get it here. I don't know if they'll ever get a win, if I'm being totally honest. That's something we can talk about a little bit later. I tend to believe the government's going to have to get involved, but at the end of the day, I wouldn't be the guy that's all over Twitter talking a little bit of trash to some opposing fan bases. I would be a little bit more quiet. Now, Cody Campbell knows what he's doing. I'm not necessarily super worried about the guy, but just to say, I don't think anyone wants to be in the crosshairs of a organization that very badly needs a win right about now, and Cody Campbell might just be stoking those fires just a little bit too much. But it'll be interesting to watch that unfold. Some other little news that came out. Joey McGuire said he wants a home with LSU. Please, that would be incredible. Would absolutely want that to unfold, and the SEC is going to have some big-time conversations about what their schedule looks like coming forward. Maybe that's included. Who knows? Maybe Brian Kelly, he was on the stage earlier. I don't think he commented on this, but maybe we can get something out of him by the end of the week about this possibly happening. WWE deal was signed by the Big 12 by Brent Yormark, and it's going to go on. It sounds like the Friday before some of these big time games in the Big 12 this year. They're going to have a SmackDown, and frankly, that's going to be awesome. There's no doubt about that. You're going to have a lot of really, really passionate, really, really intense young people that really want to see some WWE. So I thought that was a really cool thing. Another great innovative way to bring in some money to the conference. And then finally, Jake Retzlaff, someone that we've talked about quite a bit on here. He is officially out of BYU, and he didn't go into the transfer portal. He actually just unenrolled from BYU and is kind of a free agent of sorts. As of right now, BYU did not authorize him to go into the portal, so he had to just, leave school, and he's going to look around. We'll see what happens there. I think Tulane is possibly an option with some of the quarterback troubles they've had. I think some depth options for maybe a Tennessee or a Georgia is on the table, but overall, I think it's going to take him a little bit of time to get this all underway, and even if he's on a team this upcoming year, I can't imagine he's going to be able to get on the field with only about 3 weeks to learn an offense and get on the field for them. Maybe Tulane, just because of how dire that situation is, but as of right now, I wouldn't necessarily bet on us seeing Jake Retzlaff play football this year. But overall, the Big 12 media days weren't explosive by any means. I think there were a lot of kind of interesting things. A lot of people ran with that Scott Frost quote, and I didn't love it either. I'll be totally honest with you. Definitely makes me a little bit more worried about his time in UCF, and definitely, if he gets a big-time job again, a lot of people are going to question it a little bit more than they would have about a week ago. So there are definitely some things to watch there. The Big 12 media days gave way to the SEC media days today, and we'll talk about that kind of at the end of the show. But let's take one break here, and when we come back, let's talk about the biggest concerns I have for my top 10. We'll do my post-spring top 10. Probably will be updating this pretty shortly, but let's just get into the biggest concerns I have for some of the biggest national title contenders right after this. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the Big 12 media days. Not a ton of stuff that came out of that. They backed their idea of a 5+11 format going forward for the CFP. Definitely something that makes sense to me for a number of different reasons. And then, the comments from Scott Frost really kind of stole the week over there in Dallas. But let's go ahead and move forward and get into my biggest concern for the top 10, at least my post-spring top 10 that I put together a little bit ago. If you want to see the description for why I have these teams where I have them, you're more than welcome to go look back at that. Probably will be updating this with a couple of minor tweaks here pretty soon, so definitely be on the lookout for that. But let's go ahead and jump into this, and we'll start down at number 10. And we'll start with the Arizona State Sun Devils, a team that did incredible stuff last year. But the reality is, you got to replace the bowling ball. You got to replace Cam Scatterbo. And the reality is, not a lot of teams have had to replace someone of that magnitude. Because I think a lot of people understand how big of a part of the run game he was. How big of a part he was, in pass protection. And he was the heart and soul of that team and all that great stuff. This guy was a really good pass catcher. He was, I believe, third on that team when it comes to pass catching, and he was a hugely important player. He might have been first after Jordan Tyson went down, frankly. So he is a player that you're not going to replace comfortably. I'm just going to say that confidently. Now, I love Kason Brown. He can really play some football. Very, very physical guy, even though not necessarily a huge guy. Very physical at the point of attack. Kanye Udoh, same exact guy. Definitely a very, very physical runner coming over from Army. Not scared to run in between the tackles over there at Army. So absolutely will be a guy that could fill kind of that Scatterbo type role. Just be a little bit more of that aggressor, a little bit more of that bowling ball type running back that is really, really tough to come by. And this guy was as important to any team, to his team as any other player in the country was to their team. So it's going to be really, really hard to do this. Now, I think they should be okay. When you have a guy like Jordan Tyson, granted he has to stay healthy, but if you have a guy like Jordan Tyson on the outside, you have a quarterback like Sam Leavitt that should take another step forward from last year. I think Kason Brown with Kanye Udoh is a very, very talented duo. I think they're going to be okay. I would be shocked if they got the production from the running back position that they got a year ago, just because the production was so out of this world for Cam Scatterbo. They're going to have to be a little bit more diverse this year, and I think they have the capability of doing that. I'm also worried about some things on the defensive side coming into play, but the reality is, when you have to replace a player of that caliber, it's going to be really, really hard to do. Same thing that I think Penn State's kind of dealing with Tyler Warren. They might have a couple more answers up there than Arizona State does, but at the end of the day, when you're replacing the heart and soul of your team and the best player on your team, you got an uphill battle. I think they'll be able to handle it, but definitely a huge, huge blow to that team, and will be really interesting to watch how they kind of adapt going into the season. Alabama here at 9, another team that probably will bump up just a little bit in these next one, but the quarterback question has to be the biggest concern that everyone has, because I'm not saying that Ty Simpson's going to be a bad quarterback. I think he's uber talented. I think he can do all the things that Kalen DeBoer and Ryan Grubb is going to ask him to do. But I think the reality is, you look at this team. I really like the wide receivers. I really like the offensive line. I really like the pieces around him. I can't sit here confidently and say that Ty Simpson is going to light the world on fire. I can't say confidently that he is going to be the quarterback that can get them to the national title. I might say more readily that Keelan Russell ends up finishing this season for Alabama. I really like what Ty Simpson is. I think he can run this offense very effectively. I think he's going to need some help from the people around him. I think the running backs are okay. I think there's a couple of areas where they hope to get a little bit better, and that run game better get a little bit better, especially from the running back position, because you're not getting Jalen Milroe running down the sideline for 60-yard touchdowns. That's not happening this year. So you're going to have to find different ways to go about business. I think could very well be Ty Simpson stepping up into the moment, playing really good football, or at least really solid football, them running the ball effectively, playing great defense with just a nasty defense on the other side. Some concerns on that defensive side, but overall, I think you have to go into the season thinking Alabama has so much stuff in place. Can that quarterback elevate the way that he needs to? And if he can, then not going to be much of a question. It won't be a question pretty quickly, because you get Florida State right out of the gate. I think you get Georgia not too shortly after. So it's going to be a lot of big-time tests for him. If he rises to those challenges, then I'll be talking about Alabama as a big-time championship contender by week 5 or week 6. Oregon, the O-line coming together, to me, is the biggest thing. Now, we could talk about the defense, had a ton of departures. We could talk about the wide receiver room. Losing Evan Stewart earlier in the offseason was huge. You have DeCorian Moore that might end up being your number one guy at the end of the day, the freshman that just came in. All of those guys are very talented. Love Jerrion Dickey. I think Gary Bryant Jr., I think he could make some big-time plays, but the reality of the matter is you have a young quarterback back there, and the last 2 quarterbacks that came in, it was a plug-and-play situation, largely because they had one of the best offensive lines in the country, and they were continuing to put them in good positions to win. They were continuing to give Bo Nix and Dylan Gabriel as much time as they needed, and the offense just really ran from there. They need the offensive line to come together. They need guys like Isaiah World to be the guy that he was down at Nevada, up at Oregon, and that's a big-time ask. Alex Harkey coming from Texas State up to Oregon, a big-time jump. Now, I think the interior is great. You have Matthew Bedford. You obviously brought over Emmanuel Pregnon from USC. I think they're going to be really solid on the interior. Those tackles are huge. If those tackles are a little bit slower than some of the edge rushers that they're going to see, because you're going to see some really good players when you play Michigan. You're going to see some really good players if you play Ohio State down the road, or Penn State, or all these other teams. That can be the difference between going undefeated and 9-3, is that one big-time sack on 3rd and 10, or Dante Moore getting a little bit happy-footed in the first quarter because he has guys like breathing down his neck the entire time. Denied Dennis Sutton is giving this guy fits, and you have a lot of questions. So I thought about putting the wide receiver group here. In my mind, Will Stein makes that work regardless of how many guys he has in that room, so not overly worried, and frankly, you can have as much talent in that wide receiver room as you want. If you can't block, you're not going to do anything. So that O-line room coming together the way that I think it very well can. I think all these guys are uber talented. Just a little bit worried about that jump from the group of 5 to the power 5, especially for those tackles. LSU, the biggest thing for me, and I think the biggest thing for just about everyone around Baton Rouge right now, is just the defense playing to the talent level. Now, the defense was not good last year. It had moments throughout the year where you thought they were kind of getting onto something, and then they would have the Alabama game. They would have a game where they just looked all out of sorts, and the back end was a little bit all over the place, some young players playing some big-time snaps. Everyone's a year older. Harold Perkins should be healthy going into this year. Whit Weeks was at Media Days today and seems very confident in their ability to really get things going. Very excited to play against Harold or next to Harold Perkins again. But I think the reality is the back end is going to be the talk. The back end of this defense has been really bad for the last couple of years. Let's just be totally honest. I think P.J. Woodland is a huge guy to watch. Ashton Stamps has to take a step forward if they're going to be an elite defense on the back end. Mansour Deline coming in from Virginia Tech is a huge player. Jakeem Jackson coming in from Florida, another huge player. So they have the guys. On paper, they have the guys, they have the measurables, they have the physicality, and then you go up front. Dominic McKinley, a really, really beast of a defensive tackle going into his sophomore year. Gabriel Relaford, a very talented edge rusher that absolutely has the physical ability to make those plays. Can you put them all in the right situation? Can you make sure that everyone's where they're supposed to be? And can these guys just play to their talent level, or at least play close to their talent level? Because the reality is, and from a pure talent perspective, you have a top 25 defense in the country. Now, I don't know if you're going to be top 25. If you can give me top 40, I think LSU's firmly in the conversation for a national title and probably on their way to Atlanta for an SEC title. Number 6, I have Notre Dame here. There's a team that I'm so shaky on. I go back and forth, but the biggest thing to me for this upcoming year is just replacing defensive linchpins, replacing the guys that had been in your program for 4 years, are the big-time leaders, and are the best players on the field at any given moment. The biggest one, in my opinion, is Xavier Watts. And the reality is, the back end of that defense is as talented as you will find in the entire country. Whether it's Jordan Clark, very talented kid, Christian Gray, Leonard Moore, one of the most talented young defensive players in the country, the reality is none of those guys are Xavier Watts. Now, they could all kind of come together and rebuild them in the aggregate, as Billy Beane would say, but the reality is, losing a guy like Xavier Watts cannot be overstated. He makes all of the plays. He's exactly where he needs to be, and he gets some other people where they need to be a little bit quicker than maybe they would normally be there. So he is a huge player on that back end. I think they have the talent to take over. Do they have the outright leader of that back end that is really important in a defense like Marcus Freeman's? Then you go to linebacker. Jack Kaiser was a huge player for this team, kind of the communicator on that defense. I'm less worried about this group, just overall, I love Drake Bowen, Jalen Sneed, Jaden Osbury, all of those guys. They're going to play good football. I just think Jack Kaiser was one of those guys that everyone looked at when he was going through workouts because they knew he was doing everything the right way. Just got to have someone else step up into that role. Tend to believe it's going to be Drake Bowen or Jalen Sneed, but regardless, I think that linebacker room will be relatively fine. Just a huge player, a great communicator that you're going to have to replace. And then up front, I'm not super worried about this group, but Riley Mills and Howard Cross, they don't grow on trees. Those two guys were absolute freaks. They were incredibly, incredibly good against the run. And you have Jason Onye. Cannot wait to see what that guy can do. Hopefully he can stay fully healthy this year. But the reality is, those are two guys that are just absolute difference makers in every sense of the word. The same way with Michigan. Love the Michigan defensive line. Think they're going to be great this year. You're replacing Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant. Those guys don't just pop up out of nowhere. So it'll be interesting to see what they deal with. And replacing these guys, I think they have the guys behind them to match them talent level-wise. Do they have the knowledge of that defense? Do they have the communication skills to go into a Miami, play a Shannon Dawson offense, and handle it the way that they're supposed to? We'll find out pretty quickly, that's for sure. Georgia, the run game just has to be better. The run game is not remotely at UGA standard, especially this past year. They just weren't very good, frankly. The interior of that offensive line, while talented, never really got the push that they were meant to get. Tate Ratledge went through some injuries. Dylan Fairchild was a great player, but felt like they never really got the ball running the way that they normally would. And you have Jared Wilson, your center, Dylan Fairchild, and Tate Ratledge out the door. So you're replacing everyone up front. And you got Micah Morris likely plugging in. He started a lot, so not super worried about his production level. Very good run blocker, a physical freak, really. So if he's applied himself in this offseason, he could be one of the best offensive linemen in the entire SEC. Then you have Drew Bobo coming in at the center position. Very smart football player. Been around the program for a very long time. Obviously, you know by the name that his father's been around football for quite some time, so he's going to be more than fine. Very talented player. I think Daniel Calhoun is really the key, I suppose, to this offensive line, to everything coming together. Daniel Calhoun, a redshirt sophomore, I believe, maybe even redshirt freshman, frankly, very talented kid. He's got to hit the ground running. They can't start the season a little bit slow. They have the backs to really make it work. I think bringing in Josh McCray is huge. I think Nate Frazier is an absolute freak, just waiting for the right opening to really let his talent really show the way that it felt like there were moments there last year, but not fully all the way there. And then you got Roger Robinson, who's just terrifyingly big. So I think they have the guys, both on the offensive line and the running back room. it's got to be a whole lot better, because the reality is, even with Gunnar Stockton, with his running ability, keeping guys honest, and with the ability to push the ball downfield, keeping some guys honest, you got to get back to running the football. You can't put so much on your young quarterback's shoulders that by the end of the year, you're hoping that he can go out there and score you 45 points or you're in trouble. That can't happen for Georgia. Frankly, probably not going to happen with that defense. But overall, Georgia wants to get back to controlling games, and this is the way you do it. And I'm sure this is what Kirby Smart will talk about when he takes the stage tomorrow. Then you go to Ohio State. The talent part of this, I might kind of shy away from just a little bit, but I am worried about the defensive line overall. I think this D-line has been the biggest part of this Ohio State team for the last couple of years. I think you look at Jack Sawyer, JTT on the other side, you have big-time players like Tyleik Williams and Ty Hamilton on the interior. All of those guys are freaks, and all of those guys were four-year players that fully understood the defense, knew exactly where they had to be, had all of this stuff kind of mastered by the time they got on the field this past year. Not going to be the case for this group. Now, that being said, really like Kenyatta Jackson. The physical ability that he has is really, really incredible. A very big physical guy, kind of like a Jack Sawyer or a JTT. They went and got another one in Bo Atkinson from UNC. Very talented edge rusher as well. It feels like they got two guys that, at least on paper, fit that kind of mold of the Ohio State edge rusher. Will they be fully ready to go, at least in week one, against a team like Texas that they are breaking in new tackles, and that's something actually we'll talk about here in a second. But overall, I think you have the guys. I think Edric Houston is going to be a really talented player as a sophomore coming back this year. When you get past that, I'm not super confident in this group. I think they have the players. I think they have the talent, obviously, because Ohio State really doesn't have the talent, but I do think last year this was their superpower. The defensive line, especially the interior of that defensive line, kept them in every single game. There was not a game that they were out of. There was not a game that they were ever going to be out of, because there was not a team that was going to be able to run the ball for a win against this Ohio State team. I can't say that confidently right now. Now, I think it will all work out. I think Kenyatta Jackson will end up becoming a very, very good, huge player for them this year. How quickly can that happen is a big-time question mark for me, and you're playing one of the best teams in the country to start the year in Texas, and it'll be interesting to see how quickly that defensive line gets going. Over to Clemson, kind of the other side of the coin here, pass pro against the big boys. And this is something that I believe Brooks Austin was talking about when he broke down the Clemson take from Texas. If you haven't watched that, go watch just about everything over on the Film Guy Network. Does an incredible job, and you'll learn something about football. I promise you that. But this is what Clemson comes down to. They have the dudes, they have the scheme, the talent, the coaches, the everything to roll through the ACC. They are the most talented team in that conference. They have the best quarterback in that conference. They have the best coach in that conference. They have the best coordinators in that conference. The reality is Clemson doesn't just want to win the ACC anymore. They want to get back to winning national titles. They want to get back to not showing up to a Texas game and giving up 270-yard rushing touchdowns to lose that game. They don't want to be in a situation where they kick off the year with Georgia and just get their faces pounded in, just get absolutely torn to pieces the entire afternoon. That's the reality of Clemson right now. They are plenty good enough to tear apart the ACC. Are they good enough to win those playoff games when they very much matter? Because you saw them against Colin Simmons and Trey Moore and a lot of the talented edge rushers that Texas had last year. It wasn't pretty. Cade Klubnik was very, very worried in that game. His feet were shuffling all over the place, and that offensive line is a very experienced group coming back. I really like that group. You got Blake Miller as kind of your linchpin over on that left side. The reality is this team just has to be better. It just has to be better against those elite opponents. We won't be able to see it really until the postseason. So it'll be kind of interesting to see this offensive line. Are they dominating guys? If they play Miami in the ACC championship, I think them against Ruben Bain could kind of be a precursor to some of the Colin Simmons or Denai Dennis Suttons that you'll see down the road. But the reality is Clemson wants to win a national title this year. If it's going to happen, you've got to give Cade Klubnik a little bit more time than they gave against Texas, because it got sketchy for him very, very quickly, and you saw it kind of unfold against Texas. Did not push the ball downfield, and comes down to pass pro at the end of the day. For Texas, I'm looking at the offensive line as well, frankly. The offensive line overhaul is crazy at Texas this year. Now, you could look at the defensive line. I think that is a big-time worry area as well, especially the interior, losing Vernon Broughton, losing Bill Norton, losing Alfred Collins. Very, very talented players. I feel pretty confident that Kenny Baker is going to have those guys ready. I think they did a great job in the portal. I think Murad Watson's going to be an absolute freak coming over from Syracuse. I think they're going to be fine there. The guys you're replacing on the offensive line have been the soul of this team the last 3 years. When you talk about Kelvin Banks, when you talk about why am I blanking on the name? Jake Majors, excuse me. When you talk about Jake Majors, when you talk about a lot of these guys, Hayden Connor, very, very important guys that played for 3 seasons essentially right next to each other. All of them were essentially the same 5 guys. They introduced Cam Williams this past year at right tackle for someone that walked out the door. Now I'm blanking on his name. Apologies for that. But definitely a team that you're replacing 4 starters. Now, you have some guys that had some starting experience, whether you want to talk about Trevor Gooseby that will be taking over for Kelvin Banks, which is a terrifying ask for a young kid, but did a really good job towards the latter end of last year when Kelvin Banks went down with a little bit of an injury. Brandon Baker is going to have to step up huge at that right tackle position. Both very, very talented guys. They just have to take that next step. The interior looks interesting to me. I think they could be a better run blocking unit overall. But losing Jake Majors is huge. He did so many things for that offense, did such a good job calling out blitzes, calling out different guys on the defensive side of the ball. I think it's going to be Cole Hudson at that center position because of his experience, because of his confidence in that offense. Another guy with starting experience, no doubt about it. But then you could have Connor Robertson, you could have Daniel Cruz. There's a couple of different options there. Overall, you look at this offensive line, losing 4 starters is very, very hard to come back from. Losing 4 guys that essentially played the last 3 years together is even harder. So we'll find out how this all comes together. I think the talent level will be fine. I think they have one of the best coaches in the country with, why am I blanking on his name? I think they have one of the best coaches in the country. I think they'll be Kyle Flood, excuse me. I think Kyle Flood will have those guys ready in week 1, no doubt about it, but definitely something to watch. I said Ohio State's concern was defensive line. I think Texas's offensive line, and we'll find out on week 1 which one of those is not so much of a problem and one is probably going to be a pretty big problem after that game. And then Penn State. They were my number 1 team in the country as we head into this year. I think I'm going to keep that in my next one. We'll find out how I feel in about a week or 2, but championship moments for Drew Aller is the best way that I can put it. Drew Aller has to step up in these big-time moments. A lot of people want to push towards James Franklin. I totally understand that. But the way that I look at it, I don't think James Franklin has made any catastrophic mistakes that has lost them games. Now, I think he's made minor mistakes here and there in big-time games. I think there's been times when he's had a big-time game in front of them and they just haven't come fully ready to play. But the reality is, if Penn State wants to win a national title, Drew Aller doesn't have to play better for 95% of the year. He's got to play much better in that 5%. He's got to play much better against Ohio State. He's got to play much better against a team like Notre Dame, hypothetically, in the playoff. He has to be the guy that everyone expects him to be, that kind of people expected him to be last year. Because the reality is, in that Notre Dame game, he crumbled. There's a couple of different times where he made some really good plays. The majority of the time, he looked lost. He looked like his feet were all over the place. He never had a very stable base, and even without Tyler Warren, I think you were more set up for success this year. I think the offensive line is going to be great. The weapons obviously have taken a step up, especially at the wide receiver position, but he's got to make that jump. You don't get to the national title, you don't win the national title without your quarterback playing elite football. Drew Aller's been able to play really good football for 95% of the time. The reality is the 5% is the difference between going back to being Penn State, being the Penn State that we're kind of sick of seeing, and being the Penn State that finally broke through and won a national title. I think he has all the ability in the world to pull this off, and frankly, I'd probably bet on him playing better football in those big-time games this year, but I got to see it. I got to see him step up against an Oregon, against an Ohio State before I feel fully confident. We'll see if he can do that. I think he's a very, very talented kid, and overall, I think all of these teams have so much stuff in place. They have so much great things to write home about. I think there's just a couple of things that if they come together or if they don't, could totally change the season for them. I think Oregon with that offensive line, it's going to be really interesting to watch. Alabama with Ty Simpson, can he really take that big-time step forward and lead this team the way that it probably should be led, and frankly, if he does it right, they could win a national title. So a lot of different things on the table for these 10 teams. Just a little concern there. I think some of them will be totally subsided after week one. Some of them will never be subsided, and I'll be able to point back to this and just pat myself on the back just a little bit. But let's take our last break here, and when we come back, let's talk about SEC Media Days. There's a couple of different talking points I want to get into. Then we'll get into a couple of recruiting updates. We'll talk about Notre Dame getting a big-time injury to their offensive line, and a couple more things right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about my biggest concerns for my top 10 teams. Definitely some things in there that I think could keep teams from being a national title contender. If Ohio State doesn't have that defensive line to the level that it has been in past years, I don't know if they have the team to make that national title run. I think they have the talent to make it work though. So I'm not super worried about that, but definitely something to watch up there in Columbus this year. But let's get into a little bit of a catch-up. We got the SEC Media Days underway about 10 minutes from me here, but we got a couple of things that we already have to talk about from the media days, a couple of things to get you prepared for the next couple of days of media days, and we'll talk about, to start here, just want to talk about the schedule overall for media days. Today, we saw LSU, South Carolina, Ole Miss, and Vanderbilt, I believe, is still yet to go on today. I believe Ole Miss is kind of going through their rounds right about now. So a couple of different things that we'll hear from today. LSU obviously already took the stage. Brian Kelly, sounds like he tried to make a joke right away, didn't necessarily catch on the way that he was hoping. At the end of the day, there's always going to be at least one awkward moment from media days with Brian Kelly, so not super worried about that. But at the end of the day, we have LSU, South Carolina, Ole Miss today. Tomorrow's a huge one. We got Georgia and Kirby Smart. Definitely will have something to say about that team last year. Auburn, Tennessee, and Texas, and we'll talk about one of the big stories from them. For Wednesday, we got Alabama, Mississippi State, Florida, and Oklahoma. Will be really interesting to hear from John Mateer about this upcoming season for the Sooners. And then Thursday, Missouri, Kentucky, Arkansas, and Texas A&M. Will be really interesting to hear from some of those teams, particularly Missouri. Very interested to see what Eli Drinkwitz has planned for them up there in Columbia this year, because very talented team. If Bo Paribla can put it together, be a very interesting team going into this year. But some big-time talking points. 11 quarterbacks will be in attendance. The only teams that are not sending them is Bama. Not announced. I think it's going to be Ty Simpson, but they have not officially announced that yet. Kentucky introducing Zach Calzada. That will be your starter, but just a transfer guy. Don't necessarily need to take him, and had some guys that were more than worthy of going to SEC Media Days over him. Missouri, as we just talked about, Bo Paribla is not at SEC Media Days. Totally understandable. Tennessee, Joey Aguilar is not there. They haven't announced anyone, and we'll get into that here in a second. And then Texas A&M did not bring Marcel Reed. Feels like more of a seniority thing than anything else. Frankly, got a little bit of news around Le'Veon Moss this past little bit that probably will keep him away from media days. I'd love to hear him talk, if I'm being totally honest, but at the end of the day, let's be honest, he probably will not be in Atlanta this week. So we'll obviously get into that in a little bit more detail as some more stuff happens around that and we hear what the punishment's going to be, all of that stuff. But at the end of the day, 11 quarterbacks will be there. We already heard from a couple of them like Garrett Nussmeier, and it'll be really interesting to hear from some of these guys, particularly John Mateer, at least for me. Very interested to see how him and Ben Arbuckle are kind of taking over that place over in Norman. Then we got to talk about this. This will be the story of the entire week, and I can promise you without even a question, Arch Mania will be crazy. Arch Manning will be absolutely hounded every single step he walks in that Hall of Fame this upcoming week. Tomorrow is going to be insane. There will probably be more people around him than any other media day that has ever happened around any single person. He is going to be the show. There's no doubt about that. Frankly, it's going to be really interesting to see how he handles that. I think he's handled it very, very well up until this point. This will be kind of the moment when it all becomes really crystalline, where you are the starting quarterback of the University of Texas. You got to take the stage in. You're probably going to be asked some very odd questions. I'll be totally honest with you, because people have been waiting for this moment, and I think a lot of people will have a lot of questions. I'm very glad they have a time limit on these availabilities because he would be sitting there for about 12 hours if everyone got to get their questions off. But that'll be really interesting to watch. We'll have plenty to talk about on Friday when it comes to Arch Manning, but have to imagine he won't quite give the quote that everyone is looking for. I don't think he's going to give you anything crazy. I think he's just going to be Arch, and that's a relatively understated guy if you've seen him over the years. Josh Heupel, very interested to hear him talk. Oh, excuse me. Very interested to hear him talk about the quarterback situation. Obviously, Nico Imaliava finds his way to UCLA. You bring in Joey Aguilar from UCLA. How is all that working? Is Jake Merklinger really taking the strides? Is George McIntyre really taking strides? Is that quarterback position a little bit more up for grabs than some of us think right now? I think we'll find out a little bit in a couple of days here with Josh Heupel. I tend to believe it's going to be Joey Aguilar going into the season, but don't feel overly confident he's going to finish the season. So it'll be interesting to hear what Josh Heupel has to say and just how confident he is in his quarterback situation. A couple other people that I'm very interested to hear from. We talked about John Mateer. Just very interested to hear about what's going on around Norman right now because a lot of questions about what Brent Venables is going to do if this year does not go the way that he wants. Then I think Kalen DeBoer is going to be fascinating to hear from. A great offseason for Alabama. A lot of things coming into place. Feels like it's finally his team. You'll definitely feel that. There's no doubt about it. I feel like he will have a confidence to him when he takes the stage in Atlanta that he probably didn't have this time last year. So will be really interesting to hear from him the first time that he kind of doesn't have to be the guy that's taking Nick Saban's place. He's now just the Alabama head coach, and he can kind of go in with a little bit more calmness. Connor Tollison, kind of a guy that maybe you don't know the name of, the center over there at Missouri. Just really interested to see how Bo Pueblo is coming along because I think that Missouri team's right in that sweet spot where you have a very attackable schedule, you have plenty of talented players. If you can put it all together, it could be a very, very interesting team this upcoming year. And then DJ Lagway. You had some injury stuff towards the end of last year. Sounds like it was more of a lower body hernia injury than the shoulder really bothering him. But very interested to hear from him about all of that stuff. I'm sure he'll be asked, and it'll be interesting. I'm sure he'll give us the classic, feel great, feel healthier than ever. But definitely will be interesting at the very least to hear from him, and a lot of pressure on that kid to save Billy Napier's job in some ways this upcoming year. So that'll be interesting to watch, no doubt about it. But let's move on from SEC Media Days. I promise we will get back to it. We'll talk about Nick Saban maybe coming back into coaching. According to Greg McElroy, we'll talk about all of that great stuff on Friday when we have a little bit more time. But a couple of recruiting updates. Georgia just continues to roll through people. It's absolutely... Oh my goodness, excuse me. There's a lot of different things happening over there in Athens. Caden Prothero, very, very talented tight end, just a freak athlete at, I believe, 6'5", 230, number 2 tight end nationally, has committed to Georgia. This is a guy that you could put anywhere on the field. He might be a wide receiver at the next level. I tend to believe he's more of a tight end, but at the end of the day, wherever he's used, he will make plays. And then Tyree Green, a top 10 safety, but watch him run the ball. I was watching them over on the Film Guy Network, and this kid can play some football, especially even at the running back position. So whether it's him picking off balls or him actually taking handoffs at some point during his career at Georgia, with that guy with the ball in his hands is pretty special to watch. But at the end of the day, it looks like he will be a safety, very talented kid that absolutely will help out this Georgia class that might just end up being number 1 overall at the end of this year. Texas added a big-time commitment with Samari Matthews, very talented corner. This is a guy that you can just place at boundary corner, feel very confident about that side of the field, very physical, very long, definitely a guy that can make all types of plays. And Texas finds their way back into the top 10. Likely some more good news coming later this week with Derek Cooper. A lot of good news around Texas in that recruitment. We'll see what unfolds there. Obviously, quite a bit of time to go. Even a week is quite a bit of time in a recruitment these days. But at the end of the day, Texas needed one after a little bit of a skid in the month of July and the month of June. Samari Matthews makes them feel a whole lot better about what's going on right now. Baylor continues to roll on the recruiting trail. One of the more surprising groups that it continues to do some great things. Jamarian Carlton, very talented edge rusher that absolutely will play a big-time role. Jalen Battle, another defensive lineman that committed to them. And then Jordan Clay, very talented 4-star wide receiver. All of those guys launched them to the top of the group in the Big 12 in terms of recruiting. Dave Aranda's loading for a CFP run. Frankly, if you give Dave Aranda just that little bit more talent than some of the people around him, he can do some special things with it. I can promise you that. And then Florida fought off Bama for a big-time linebacker commit, KJ Ford. There was kind of an interesting situation where he released his top three. Alabama was not a part of it. Then about 2 days later, he got a crystal ball to go to Alabama, and everyone was very confused, trying to figure out where it came from. Is Alabama really back in this thing? Sounds like Kalen DeBoer might have messed this one up. Now, all of this reporting is speculative, nothing absolutely set in stone, but it sounds like he could have kind of messed this one up just a little bit because went on a visit there, and it sounds like just kind of talked bad about Florida. Didn't do too much talking good about Alabama, just tried to tear down the team that he was possibly going to go to, and that's where he ended up. So a little bit of a crazy recruitment towards the end of it, but Florida ends up getting the guy that they expected to get from the get-go, and then let's move on from recruiting here for a second because Charles Jagasaw, we got to talk about here for a second. He was injured in a UTV accident this past week. He actually has a broken arm, it sounds like. It sounds like he has a broken arm, not on the lower half in the forearm, but in the upper half, kind of in the bicep, tricep area. Big time injury, no doubt about that. He was actually slated to be the starting left tackle going into last year before he got injured, and some guys had to shuffle around and make that work, and it was a plenty good unit last year. So Notre Dame is more than capable of replacing some of these guys, more capable than a lot of other teams out there. No doubt about that. It sounds like it's going to be Sullivan Absher kind of taking over for him, probably at left guard this time around, if I had to imagine. But Miami and A&M are two games we're getting pretty much right off the bat. You got to be ready to roll. It won't be Jagasaw out there until later in the season, and we'll see what happens with him. But the reality is they got to be ready to roll because two defensive lines that love to get after you and two very, very talented players on the other side will be waiting for you when you talk about Ruben Bain and when you talk about Cassius Howell for A&M. It's going to be a lot to handle, and they're down one of their offensive linemen. Now, I feel very confident Notre Dame can bounce back from this, but really, really tough way to start the fall camp for Notre Dame, and we'll see what happens with that offensive line room over the next month or so. And then just a couple of minutes on this, the SCORE Act is something that's been introduced to the House of Representatives here recently. It sounds like essentially it is a way to get enforceable rules in college football that work across the board, that aren't, put on by the conference, aren't put on by the school, aren't put on by state laws that are in place for NIL. It's essentially what the House settlement was meant to do, just with the government sign-off, which I think college football might end up needing by the end of this. But at the end of the day, I'm not going to hold my breath. Anything in the world of government, I'm not going to hold my breath to see get done, if I'm being totally honest. So at the end of the day, we'll find out what happens with this. I think it's another opening. I think it's another opening to find a way back to relative reality in the world of college football. Can't say it's going to go perfectly. I'm not sure if this all is going to even pass, if I'm being totally honest. But it does feel like if this does pass, and we can get antitrust laws in place and we can get antitrust exemptions, we can do all of that great stuff around college football, it feels like we can start getting back to reality. Again, I would not hold your breath. I would not wait on the SCORE Act to come through because probably going to take a little bit of time to get all the ducks in a row and get everyone on board. But at the end of the day, it shows that the government is paying attention. It shows that enough people are paying attention, enough powerful people are paying attention to the sport now, and hopefully it leads to some type of resolution to all of this craziness. Again, it'll take time, so don't necessarily hold your breath there, but will be really interesting to watch that unfold. But that'll do it for this edition of Just Another College Football Podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please like, subscribe, comment, do all of that great stuff. I can absolutely put in any questions you have into Friday's show, so please drop anything you have in the comment section. Would be more than happy to get around to that on Friday's show. But a lot of different things going on my social pages. If you want to follow over on X, _Thomas, or JACFB Podcast, another one over there on Twitter, as well as on Instagram. So please go follow in those places. Definitely will be releasing more kind of short form content, maybe some hot takes coming here in the month of August, but a lot of different things happening around Just Another College Football Podcast over the next month or so. So definitely be following on all those pages. Like, subscribe, comment over here, and let's continue to have a great time as we count down the days to college football season. Believe we're hitting 40 right about now, so going to be awesome to count down the days. But let's make sure you do all that stuff. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you guys on Friday.